Funny seeing you
Okay,
here.
shall we start? Nodding of heads, you guys ready?
Yeah.
All right. So first show of hands, how many of you were here for the last meeting that we had for this? All right, so pretty much a lot of continuity. So part of the reason that we're here, and this is the second of two meetings, and we're going to do an encore performance of this for our Wayside Cleanup Advisory Committee meeting on Thursday, if you really want to do it again, to talk about where we're going with natural resource damage assessment, and particularly in developing regulations that will standardize the process, particularly for smaller releases that don't require, shouldn't require large-scale, intensive, site-specific information, using NRD assessment. Last time we focused on direct releases to surface waters. Today we'll talk in more detail about groundwater, and the purpose of all of this is, one, to give the department kind of your feedback and your expertise on kind of how we should be going about this, whether we should be going about this, and to help us prepare the best draft set of regulations that we can, so that when we do go out for public comment, and there will be additional public comment through the formal process, what people are reading and reacting to is as clear as possible. The goals and objectives of the regulations are clear and easy to follow, and we've put thought up front into how the process would work, so that when people look at those regulations, read them, and provide comment, the comments will be that much better because the first draft of the regulations will be better. And that way, hopefully we can get the best set of comments back to make the eventual final regulations better still. So your feedback is important to us, and we value it, we listen to it. And the draft regulations will change based upon what you tell us, and suggestions and comments and insights that you can give us. And even then, as it goes out for public comment, final regulations will change again based upon those comments. So the goal is to have as good a set of final regulations as possible, and this is just one piece of that. But the earlier the better. If we can get it 90% now, then we'll get better comments and better interaction as we move forward. Anything else I should say before?
I don't think so. The only thing I would add to that is, so Paul talked about the goals of this meeting and the goals of the reason we have this stakeholder group. I just remind people that the schedule we're working on is to have a public hearing draft in July, and we talked about the oil spill to surface water method at the last meeting, and today we're talking about the groundwater. So the hope is to have a package that contains both those methods, as well as sort of the administrative details of how we would process the claims as part of that package. So we're interested in your feedback on the method and the basis for the method, as well as how this might work administratively to be most efficient for us.
And whatever additional information you think would be helpful for those future reviewers, including yourselves, when the regs go out, what kind of package we can put together that will be informative and help people understand the draft regulations.
Yeah, just to also mention that there will there be two reports or combined as one?
Two separate reports.
So in addition to the method, there'll be two background documents that go through the detail of what you'll have heard at these meetings, and incorporate the feedback in terms of coming up with the public hearing draft. So you'll be able to read the report, and they should reflect the method that's proposed in the public hearing draft, and give you the supporting information and examples of it applied to actual sites.
Okay, any questions before we get into the nitty-gritty details? Excellent.
Karen, did you want everyone to go around and
Yeah, starting
we should.
with the folks on the phone, if we
Okay,
could.
yeah, if the folks on the phone can take a stab at I know this is always hard, but if you can go left to right on the phone, take a stab at just who's on the phone and your affiliation.
Karen went east to west or west to east across the state.
Okay, west to east across the state, starting in western Massachusetts or beyond. Okay, Central Mass.
Andrea Donlin, Connecticut River Conservancy.
Oh, that's western. There we go.
Jen Peterson, Mass Waterworks Association.
Okay. I heard another voice in there.
Matt Monstroller representing the Mass Waterworks Association.
Okay.
Michael Ferrante, Mass Energy Marketers Association.
Heidi Ritchie, Mass Audubon.
Anybody else? Okay, and then in the room, I'm Paul Locke, Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Wayside Cleanup, and
Liz Callahan, Wayside Cleanup, Policy Regulations.
Scott Friedman with Industrial Economics.
Karen Pelto, NRD Program Coordinator.
Alicia Hunt, Environmental Director for the City of Medford.
Ron Ruth, lawyer with Sharon and Lodge.
Steve Sharon, Global Partners.
Chris Gill, Gulf Oil.
Matt Young with the LSPA and Cumberland Farms.
Dot McGlincy, Mass Association of Conservation Commissions.
Marty Hilfinger with Nexema and Cumberland Farms.
Steve Dodge, Mass Petroleum Council.
Chris Ayers, MassDEP, Office of General Counsel.
Janine Comerford, Haley and Aldrich.
Ken Lara, MassDEP and 21J Board.
Brian Roden, MassDEP, Policy and Programs.
Julie Hutchison, MassDEP, Marine Oil Spill Prevention and Response Program.
And Pat Corcoran, EnviroTrack and LSPA.
Jason Frigon, Nexema and Global Partners.
Greg McBride, GZA.
Okay, and was there somebody who just came in on the phone? Nope. Okay. And
Mia McDonald from Worcester is saying that she's on, but she doesn't have a mic.
okay, great. And for those of you on the phone, the meeting is being recorded and we'll post it. So if there's anybody else who wants to kind of see what we're and hear what we're talking about, it will be available later. So next up, Karen?
Yes.
So did you want this? You need to advance?
Here's I'm going to start with outside. So I'm just going to give a brief update. As you know, and for those who don't, we had a meeting earlier this month on the oil spill method and proposed approach, and I just wanted to give a brief update. In addition to taking careful notes on the questions that were raised at that meeting, we did receive written questions from, and I didn't know how to pronounce your acronym, so I'm glad to know Nexema. Excellent. So we will be posting those questions as well as our written response to Nexema on our website so that as we are moving through the stakeholder process, everyone can have the benefit of seeing those. Just so you know, one of the questions that came up in the group and also as a follow-up had to do with the RTNs that were used in the oil spill analysis, and so we will be posting that information as well. So as I think we ran things in the last, if there are clarifying questions as we go through, please interrupt because we want to make sure that we all have a clear understanding of the content that's being presented today. And then I would expect a similarly robust discussion session as we did to the first, which was extremely helpful to us as we think about putting together this draft regulations and updated method. So I'm going to just give an overview and give you some context for groundwater natural resource damages, which we actually have been involved with for many years using a more comprehensive method. And then Scott, I'll turn it over to Scott to talk in more detail about the standard approach that we are have been in development. Yeah. Yeah. So as a review, pretty much everything that we can sense is a natural resource held in trust for the public by the Commonwealth. And today we're particularly focused on groundwater as a resource and water supply as the service provided by that resource. Again, the distinction between the types of activities that occur once there is a release to this resource is the cleanup, which looks at the nature and extent of contamination and taking actions to eliminate or reduce risk. Under a damage assessment, we're also looking, we use a lot of the same information, but we're looking at the type and extent of injury. And Scott will talk a little bit. It's interesting because when it comes to groundwater, it is a much more straightforward definition of injury because it simply relates to a standards and an exceedance of standards. And then when we come to restoration, rather than eliminating risk, we're actually looking to restore those resources so that we are compensating the public. And the authorities, again, we have statutory authority in Massachusetts, both under 21E as well as under the legislation that governs the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. We also have authority under federal law. In Massachusetts, we have one trustee for natural resources, and that's the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and DEP has been delegated to administer the program on the trustee's behalf. There are some decisions, though, that solely rest with the trustee, and we confer on a quarterly basis with the Secretary's senior staff. What's different about this presentation than the last is that we are not working with federal trustees when it comes to groundwater. Groundwater is a state trustee resource. There are some ongoing disputes based on land ownership that we're not going to address or attempt to even describe today, but by and large, groundwater is a state-only trustee resource. So when it comes to making the claim, when it comes to resolving the claim, and then implementing the restoration, it would be, in this case, the state of Massachusetts. As I mentioned, we have actually been including groundwater in our settlements in the past, and the ones in bold here, with the exception of Textron, the Textron plumes at the MMR, which was a 21E settlement, the others are all cases that were settled under CERCLA. And so there were federal trustee involvement because each of these involved both ecological and groundwater settlement. So for example, with Sutton Brook, it was evenly half and half groundwater and ecological settlement. With Nyanza, the groundwater settlement was much smaller, a few $100,000. Charles George didn't really, it was an older settlement and didn't really parse them out, but some of the restoration involved land acquisition that was aquifer protection as well as habitat. And with Blackburn and Union, a few $100,000 again is strictly groundwater with another 125 to 150 of restoration intended to address both types of resources. Just to give you an example of the injury and restoration, I chose Textron because the restoration for that is entirely complete. Here again, it was a munitions testing by a contractor within specific ranges within what was known at the time as the Mass Military Reservation, now known as Joint Base Cape Cod. There were exceedances of drinking water standards, which again are considered an injury to groundwater. The Cape is a sole source aquifer, but it was also within the wellhead protection areas of local communities. In this case, the contaminant was perchlorate. The restoration involved really two main types of projects. Two projects that acquired land for aquifer protection and two projects that were involved in assisting communities in completing comprehensive management plans that then would make them eligible for state revolving fund loans at lower interest rates that are particularly available to the Cape to reduce and address nutrient pollution. This is on the day of the dedication of the acreage in Mashpee, which became actually part of what's being managed as the Mashpee National Wildlife Refuge. Another example that we're just beginning the process of, we're actually within the next few weeks going to release the restoration plan, and I'll certainly share that once it's public with everyone who's here, so you can take a look at it. This is unfortunately not an updated graphic, so that's on me. But the text is updated. This was a circular site located in the head of the Neponset, again, another sole source aquifer, a wider range of contaminants, a different type of site. In terms of the injury and restoration, we are actually publishing the plan of the groundwater portion as seeking comment on the different types of restoration, categories of restoration that might be accomplished here for recharging to groundwater, clean recharge to groundwater, as well as a number of types of activities that could reduce demand and therefore protect groundwater. Some integrated management, again, similar to what was done in Textron, and then always we're open to land acquisition, although two things lead me to believe we won't necessarily hear that that's a priority for this area. Through the public meetings, these types of activities seem to be more in line with what the communities were looking to do, as well as the fact that land in that area is likely too expensive unless someone came in with a partnership proposal. So before Scott dazzles you with analysis,
pressure's on.
right, I'm going to underwhelm you with a very simple schematic. So when we look at our groundwater method, and again, the method that we used in the prior settlements has the same general features as the one that Scott's going to illustrate. It's that some of the inputs have changed to make it a more something that could be applied on a statewide basis as opposed to a site-specific basis. But in both cases, we're starting with an area. We're starting with an area of groundwater that is not meeting a drinking water standard or some other health-related drinking standard related to water supply. And we end up with an area that we would need to protect in order to help preserve water quality in a particular aquifer. It's not a one-to-one relationship. It's not that if you had a 10-acre plume, you have to protect 10 acres of land. There's a lot in between. And the first part is that we convert that area into a volume. And Scott will explain sort of how we do that. I will leave that to him. That volume we then look at over time. We say, okay, how long has that volume of water been unavailable due to contamination? It could be 1 year, it could be 10 years, it could, in some of the cases that I've already settled, be 100 years or more. So then we say, okay, well, what is that total volume lost over that time period? And then we say, okay, out of the total volume lost and the time period that we know, what is the annual volume that we would need to replace in order to compensate the public? I'm looking at Scott to make sure I don't misspeak. He's nodding, this is good. And so once we know that, we can say, okay, if we were going to sink a theoretical well to produce that volume, that annual replacement volume, what would it be? And in this, we again do some more math and we get it down to gallons per minute. And that's what we use to calculate the area for restoration. Because in Massachusetts, we have regulations that our drinking water folks have developed that basically speak to two different types, well, actually really three. One is a zone 2, which you can actually go out in the field and through measurements, a town or community or municipal or private water supplier could determine the area of contribution of groundwater to their well. If you don't have that, there's something called the interim wellhead protection area, which is something you can calculate. And in the settlements that I identified in this presentation, that's what we used to determine the area. Which basically says, you know, if you know the gallons per minute of your well, what's the area around it that you should protect absent doing a site-specific zone 2 analysis? Then there's something called the Zone 1, which Scott will get into, which is another way for lower yielding wells to determine an area to conserve. So basically, in order to determine the injury and determine the required restoration, we go through these steps. And the reason we want to get to an area is because, first of all, our regulations provide for calculating that, and it's been well established in the drinking water world. And second, it's a way of us to be able to value. So with a site-specific analysis, like, for example, Textron, we can, well, I'll actually use Sutton Brook because it was one community. We look at that community's, in this case, Tewksbury's, land values in a particular type of way to get $1 per acre. And so if we know, say, ultimately we need to protect 10 acres of land and we know what land costs per acre in that community, we can then come up with a claim number that we can then bring into the negotiation in terms of the comprehensive method. So I just wanted to lay that groundwork for the more details. Yes, question?
So a spill in Dover is way more expensive than a spill in Brockton?
Yes, for those on the phone, a spill in Dover is way more expensive than a spill in Brockton. And if you're using the comprehensive method, yes, it is. And of course, depending on the characteristics of the spill as well. Always that caveat. But land...
But the same spill in both towns
right. Yep.
would be more expensive than...
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Any other questions before we move on?
So does this only apply if your release is in a PPA or a Zone 2, a designated area where groundwater is being used?
Oh, thank you for that question, because I realized I forgot to run through my numbers.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So the question was the applicability of this method in terms of Zone 2s, PPAs, etc. So for the purposes of, well, first I'll say for the cases that we've settled to date, we have all of those cases were within potentially productive aquifers. They may have also been in Zone 2s and in sole source aquifers that were sort of additional layers of designation, but they were all within potentially productive aquifer locations. In terms of the analysis that we're about to present to you, Brian Roden assisted us in some data crunching. We looked at between April 2014 and December of 2017, we looked at releases that achieved a permanent or temporary solution between those two dates. That also, so that was the first step, and there were 4,172 RTNs associated with that data range that reached that milestone, one of those two milestones. Then, out of that, we looked to see, well, which one of those checked that they were in a GW1 area on the form. That brought it down to 320 RTNs. Then we said, okay, but to truly be an injury, it has to impact the groundwater. So out of those 320, 265 of those were demonstrating that they had impacted groundwater. They had exceeded a standard in the actual groundwater. The others may have simply affected soil, but they were in a GW1 area, so they had checked it on the form. Then, for reasons Scott will describe in his analysis, 73 of those were greater than or equal to 1 acre in terms of the disposal site boundary. And out of that 73, 36 of them were the ones that had reached a permanent solution during those same 3 years. Brian and I shared responsibility for looking at those 36 just to see, okay, what kind of information is there? What type of releases are these? What does this universe look like? And we actually came across some interesting observations, and I'm going to just run through a few, Brian, and if you want to add, please feel free. Some, even though they might have indicated an acre on the form, were actually less than an acre when you looked into the report, so we've set those aside. Some reported that their exceedances were due to, for example, naturally occurring arsenic, so we set those aside. Some were both, had affected both wetlands and groundwater, so for the purposes of this assessment, we set them aside because that would just made it a more complex test case. I would say overall, one of our observations is that the disposals, the area, the question in the form that says report the number of acres that this statement, permanent or temporary solution statement, in this case permanent solution statement applies to, and then there's a response there, didn't always correspond well with, say, the mapped area of impact in the permanent solution statement itself. So what we tried to do, and I think we were relatively successful, is we tried to find releases that took place in the various regions where the disposal site and the impacted area were similar, matched up pretty well, that had different types of contaminants, oil and hazardous materials, as well as oil/hazardous materials, sort of a range of reasons why the groundwater was injured, and came up with 5 for back testing so that we could give you some examples today. Am I missing anything?
I think that's it.
Generally it. Because we wanted to be able to present something to you today that really reflect, I guess, some real world examples, but also reflect our thought process so that you can understand how we got down to what we consider to be, in terms of the, well, I call it the 36, but it's probably more like 30 when, after you account for the ones you really need to permanently set aside. What really is, number one, that this method does offer us, we think, a really valuable screening tool. And that number two, if we do have to do a little more looking into the reports, it's a pretty manageable number. That said, however, in the future, with we would like to limit the degree to which we have to look into the reports. However, it does give us a pretty manageable number to work with. So, if there's no other questions from me, yep.
I actually have a remedial clarification question, because I don't work in this world as much, very much. I didn't understand all the terms that we're using, and I think that some of them were identifying the difference between aquifers that could potentially be tapped for drinking water and ones that could not be.
Yes.
And I just didn't know that for sure that that's what those terms meant. And so in the big picture here, though, what you're looking to do is to only apply them to aquifers that could be potentially tapped for drinking. Because, like, I think in the inner core here, like in Medford, if anybody said to me that they wanted to tap groundwater for drinking, I'd go, whoa. And I don't know, maybe it's mapped and they're legally not allowed to, maybe they are, I'd have to look into it, I've never been asked. But my impression is that all the water, groundwater in this inner core area really isn't drinkable, and therefore it would be out. Is that a reasonable assumption, and does that, how that maps into this as I'm looking to apply it?
I'll give kind of the legal world, and then Scott will give the kind of the a more general response, I guess, because it seems like you want to jump in on this one too. So basically, and if I misspeak, Liz or Paul, please jump in. But I will say, in terms of the ones that we have, as I mentioned, the ones where we have already settled using a comprehensive method, it has been areas that are either currently used or could potentially be used for drinking water. And so there are, in Massachusetts, mapped areas based on aquifer productivity, those areas, current and potential drinking water supplies, or potentially productive aquifers, which was cited earlier. There are also overlaying on top of that, there are mapped areas called non-potential drinking water source areas, which are the scenario you just described, based on land use, where not only would most people not, we would prefer they not sink a drinking water well. And so even though it might be in an aquifer that could produce the yield, if it is overlain by a non-potential drinking water source area, In the past, we have not pursued cases, and in the future, we would likely not pursue cases. Now, that's not necessarily the same in every state because groundwater still has an inherent value, but in terms of policy-wise, how we have chosen to implement this program, that's where that would help define our focus. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, you got to what I wanted to make sure
Okay.
it's clear that it doesn't have to be in use at the time or designated for use across all the states. They can designate groundwater differently. So you will see industrial economics reports and cases settled in other states where the drinking water was not in whatever Tennessee's zone 1 would be.
But thank you, and that's why I like to have clarifying questions. Ron, did you have some questions?
It's similar question, so
Okay,
thank you.
sure, thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to, which is not to say you can't ask me a question as we go along. Oh, yes, that would help.
All right. Well, now the pressure's on because I have a lot set up here to go through. So from the oil spill approach, this is very different in many ways. Just at the surface, you can't see it because it's in the ground, and there's also a lot more math in this. So if you do have any questions as I go through, please just stop me and ask me. I'll also say that there's a lot of interface here with groundwater economics as well as the science behind it and the conservation of groundwater behind it. And I am science trained, but I've been working in this science economic interface for a decade now. And if we do have any really complicated or in-depth economic questions, I'll do my best to answer them, but I might defer them to a later date. So I'll start by going over the purpose, talk a little bit about the services that groundwater provides beyond just the drinking water, beyond drinking water itself, and NRDA methods for quantifying damages in groundwater. There's a method we apply here and a method that you'll see most often applied, but there are a number of different methods that have been used over time across states in different areas. And we have been doing this for about 2 decades now, worked on more than 3 dozen groundwater sites from Alaska to the Virgin Islands and other exotic places like New Jersey and New York. We've had, I'll go through the approach that we're proposing here, some de minimis considerations, what's less than an acre, for example, and then talk about or present the results of looking at the historical data. So I know everyone does want to know what the answers are first, and so I'm not going to make you wait that whole time because this is going to get a little bit into the math, or a lot into the math at a point. And so I just want to quickly go through this so people have a sense of where we're going to end up, and everyone's not just sitting on the edge of their seat waiting for it. So we were looking at sites, the 5 sites were between 1 and 2 acres in size, and their time frame of contamination, the calendar component of Karen's schematic, was as short as 2 years to as long as 25 years. And CERCLA was enacted in the December of 1980, but normally applied in 1981 in the context of NRDA. So the longest time frame would be 1981 to the present and into the future, depending on the remedial decision ROD that comes out. The present value, and the present value is part of the economics of it. If I give you $1 today, or $1 in 10 years, or I gave you $1 yesterday, all those values of the dollar in the present time are different, and I'll get into that. Well pumping rates, we're looking at the gallons per day range from 178 to almost 2,000, a little bit less than 2,000. Restoration protection in acres, 0. One fell into the de minimis category of the 5, and the largest one resulted in the requirement of 1.38 acres for restoration. And again, it's not 1-to-1 of restoration. Acquisition costs, which is what I think you were getting at in Dover and I forget the town, change as you move in areas across the state, across the country for that matter. So we had low range of 990 up to about 34,000. So the compensatory restoration ranged from 0, because we had 0 acres to restore, up to about 32,000. Purpose of this effort is largely the same as for the oil spill approach. We're looking to increase the cost efficiency of conducting NRDAs, as well as looking at the opportunities to expedite restoration or get restoration on the ground faster and ensure that the public is compensated. All right, so now we've gone through that stuff. Now we're going to get into the interesting stuff, and then the model and the math here. So groundwater provides a number of different services. Obviously, you can think of one right away. It's you're drinking that groundwater. You're also using that groundwater for irrigation of crops. In their industrial uses of groundwater, there's uses of groundwater that, if you extract it, it prevents subsidence. Groundwater is being discharged to surface water and supporting ecological communities. So that's all things that you can touch and feel. There's future use of groundwater as well. And that future use is what the economics literature considers an option value. So I know that there's groundwater in the ground. I think that groundwater is important for us because we need to drink water. And I want to know that that groundwater is going to be clean in 10 years for me to drink, and in 20 years, and so on. And the evidence for why, or the evidence that this is important to almost, I think, every state in the country and every United States province is that, or territory, is that there's legislation. And individual states have put forth different legislation that state the importance of groundwater. We protect groundwater in different ways. And so there's clear evidence in the economic literature that we're voting for individual legislatures that are putting in place these policies and laws. There's also economic literature out there that has done surveys on specific sites and asking people about their willingness to pay. So the simplest way is they would ask you if you, to ensure you had clean groundwater for the rest of your life, would you be willing to pay $1 a day, $10 $1 a year, sorry, or $10 a year, whatever it is. And in every case, they've come out with evidence of people's importance for groundwater. So this is talking about the assessment process in general for groundwater, not specific to what we're doing here, but it does, each piece of this goes into the development of the approach. And so it's in addition to the remedial process, which Kara already went over. In a NRD, you got to define the pathway, how the contaminant got to the natural resource. Then you got to determine injury. And so if people want to talk a little bit more about remedial or pathway, we can, but I'm going to dive right into the injury here. And for the purposes of this assessment, does the groundwater contaminant concentration exceed a state or federal standard? Outside of this assessment, just for your own information, there can be a situation where there is no standard, but the groundwater was taken off use due to a contaminant. So you can just think of that as emerging contaminants where state or feds do not have a threshold yet for that. And you can still show a natural resource damage assessment loss. Baseline, Karen touched on it, naturally occurring arsenic. Other examples might be intrusion of salt water naturally, would make that drinking water unavailable for use anyway. After we've established injury, thought about accounted for baseline, we then look at the quantity of groundwater loss. And that's the volume over time, and that's where the math is going to come in. Then we determine damages, which is the dollars to restore the recharge. And the damages can be restoring the recharge through land protection, or it can be other ways of restoring recharge, catchment basins, reducing stormwater runoff, etc. There are a number of different methods for quantifying groundwater. I'm not going to go into all of them here. I'm just going to touch on a few of them. And I'm happy to talk about any if people have questions, or I can overload you with the literature on any one of these. that you need several hours to read through. So what we use here is we use what's called a RIA, or a replacement cost approach, and that RIA is a resource equivalency analysis, and that takes into account the time and the volume of the resource. Resource equivalency analysis you may often see done in other contexts of NRDA or valuations when there is something that comes in over time, and you can think of it as an annuity, that it's paying a dividend or a payment every year. There's other things in there, other methods in there. The added cost method is what is the added cost to treating that groundwater and getting new or clean water to the affected communities. That added cost, depending on the circumstance in the state, may or may not be captured by the resource equivalency analysis, and that can be added to the resource equivalency analysis. It's also well established that because the option value of groundwater is important to the populations, that just hooking them up to municipal water or bringing them bottled water is not a substitute for the contamination of groundwater, and that's also specifically mentioned in the federal regulations. I will just skip down to one other example here, the property analysis. There's been a bunch of work done on the impacts of groundwater contamination on property prices. And while that sounds like a really nice way of doing groundwater valuations, it doesn't work as well because there's so many things that affect property that it's often hard to tease out what is the effect of groundwater as opposed to the effect of the economy or whatever else of it. So RIA, resource equivalency analysis. Go a little bit through this and then hop into some details. Widely applied in the context of NRDA. Right now I am engaged in 4 different NRDAs with using RIA for groundwater. There's a couple that are dormant, that are in the works, and we've been doing this, as I said, at 3 or 4 dozen sites. I mentioned the services before, but they have these, the one that's important here that I want to make sure I highlight again is this option value of the groundwater in the future. And the RIA allows you to replace that option value of groundwater in the future because you're recharging groundwater in clean groundwater at a site. RIA also measures the actual groundwater in there and not a theoretical thing like the ability to pay, or willingness to pay for groundwater protection or the property values. It's actually the volume of groundwater, and so that's one of the attractions or benefits of this approach. It avoids placing a monetary value on the groundwater itself. So one approach that was initially proposed when the NRDA regulations came out was that it could be the tap price. So what was the cost of delivering water to those folks if there was municipal water hookups, or if there could be municipal water hookups, and that's problematic because that includes the price of putting the pipes in the ground, maintaining the pipes, collecting the bills, and so on and so on. It also focuses on restoration, which everybody is what the goal is. But as I mentioned, it does not address added cost, and that's the biggest problem with that. And so sometimes municipalities may have added costs. They may need to sink a new well. They may need to change their pipes because the contaminant's corroding their pipes. Those costs are not captured generally in RIA. And I also wanted to mention that RIA can be applied in the context of oil spills as well, but it was not used there. We were using a similar approach of habitat equivalency analysis, but the time frames were different and some of the inputs were different. So the inputs, as I mentioned, start with the injured groundwater, the quantity of groundwater in volume. You take into account the future loss and the past loss. In all the cases I'm going to show you today, there was a permanent solution reached by 2017, as Karen mentioned, so there's no future loss. So we're not going to be dealing with that. And we're taking a discount rate of 3%, and that's standard practice. for a natural resource damage assessment, and it takes into the fact that $1 today is not the same as if I took $1 from you a year ago, or 10 years ago, or 25 years ago. And that gives me the total present value. So what's the present value of all of the yearly groundwater loss today? On the other side, we have a credit, or a restoration side. Do the same thing, we restore the volume of groundwater in present value. We take into account the cost of restoration, and in this case, we're going to be talking about the cost of protecting groundwater recharge. We use the same 3% discount rate, and that gives me a present value restoration cost, which is then scaled against the loss, and we determine what our damages are. All right, so I've said a lot, so I am going to pause to catch my breath and see if there are any questions.
I want to be clear that, because through all of this, I try to keep clear in my head that there's a difference between what somebody is going to pay to literally clean it up, fix the problem, and what somebody's going to pay because they have damaged a natural resource and they need to, and that's the end that this is about. When you talk about the cost of restoration, is that the amount that they pay to clean up the problem?
Nope, that's remedial. This is compensatory restoration, so it's not a fine, and it's not to bring it back to baseline. In the cases I'm going to show you, the releases I'm going to show you in a moment, the remedial actions have already taken place, and they've already paid to extract and treat groundwater, or in situ treatment, and now it's restoring that interim loss that's compensatory.
So right, so that the amount that it costs to clean up the problem is not in any way taken into account here. Right? I just want to be clear about that, because then I understood when you were using the term restoration, I thought that meant the whole thing. This is the restoration to people, but now it's a sub piece of it. So I think, like, I'm confused by the terms being used. That the final dollar amount, right, is the restoration.
The final dollar amount is the compensatory restoration for natural resource damages.
Which is different from this cost of restoration, which is an input.
That's.
I'm trying to get the difference.
The cost of restoration here is a unit cost.
Okay.
Right? So it's the cost of protecting 1 acre.
Okay.
And then 1 acre gives you 1,000 gallons. And if you had an injured 1,000 gallons, your costs are just that. But if you have 10,000 gallons, you have to multiply your unit cost by 10.
So after the cleanup has been done, the permanent solution, are there still future injuries in your calculation?
Not in these calculations, but there can be. So I'm working on a site now, not in Massachusetts, where they've installed wells down gradient and they're pumping the water, treating it, putting it back in up gradient to stop it from reaching the next municipal water supply. That will go on for at least another 50 years, is our estimate, so maybe 100 years. But even though they've now contained it and they've reached what we might in Massachusetts, or they've reached what they are considering, sorry, not in Massachusetts, but they are considering a permanent solution for the site, because it's going to permanently basically be there, these pump and treat wells. That groundwater now is contained, so there's not an expanding plume. The plume is now going to be
but we would call
stagnant.
that a temporary solution in old MCP speak.
Right.
In current MCP speak, if we have a permanent solution, in this scenario, the future injury is 0, so you're only looking back. The spill was 10 years ago.
Right.
It took 10 years to get to a permanent solution. Therefore, the past injury period is 10 years.
Correct.
You spent whatever money you spent on cleaning it up is incidental but irrelevant to the Commonwealth's damage for its potential non-use of that resource during that 10-year period.
Except for the fact that you stopped it from spreading.
Well,
and you stopped it.
You helped yourself.
Yeah, right.
Containing the air.
When you said incidental,
Yeah,
There's
but it's
benefit to
irrelevant to
cleaning
this
up.
calculation.
It's not
Not
incorporated
included
in,
in
right,
here.
right,
Correct.
yep.
Or is it also, does this make sense? We make a policy decision in this method to stop it at the point of permanent solution. But there may still be some groundwater contamination there, so I guess technically you could go into the future, but this method does not do that.
Right, oh, no, I mean, this could all get metaphysical if you push it, but within your realm, you're stopping that
Yeah.
permanent solution.
Right, yeah.
So I actually had a question that I should have asked before, but about how you get to this theoretical well that tells you how many gallons. You're gonna go there, okay.
I'm gonna go there.
Good.
So for folks on.
Sorry, so she was asking how we get to the theoretical well and the gallons per day or gallons per minute pumping rates, and that's the next part of this presentation here. So a couple of highlights here on what goes into those inputs, or behind those inputs, is we start with the time frame here, when the injury occurs, when it ends, and what our current year is. So we want to bring everything into 2018 volume and 2018 dollars. We also get a recharge rate, so that I'll talk about in a moment, but that's how much water reaches the ground. And we can take into account a change in area of contamination. Like if it was in the future, we could reduce the area of contamination, or if there is a remedial action implemented midpoint through your 10-year example, that would start to reduce the plume size. So if the plume was 10 acres in year when it was characterized, 5 years go by of characterization, just to make the numbers easy. There's a remedial in situ treatment system put in. That treatment goes on for 5 years. We've assumed that the plume decreases 20% every year after that. And linear decrease 20% each year after that.
Could I just, on your baseline, so what about the whole commingled plume situation?
You mean 2 PRPs?
Yes.
So
2 releases.
I'll hand that over to Karen, but I don't think any of our 5 examples had two PRPs.
None of our examples that we're going to show you. I guess I can only speak to the past cases where, for example, the Sutton Brook disposal area was a landfill with like 43 different PRPs, and under NRD it's joint and several liability.
Right, but Sutton Brook was one landfill.
Right.
It wasn't, I mean, if we're talking gas stations, often you have commingled plume, gas station A, gas station B, and.
Right, then there would be more than one PRP that would.
And how would this apply? They each pay, let's say it's $25,000, they each pay 25, or they pay $12.50 each, or?
Sure. So the question was, for those folks on the phone, what about commingling plumes when you might have either the one plume with completely overlaying two sources, or plumes that are not completely overlaid, where there might be one plume that's 10 acres, and within that plume there's another plume that's an acre from another source. So on other sites, not here in Massachusetts, but on other sites, I've calculated damages for that commingled portion and damages for the non-commingled portion. But those sites have a lot of characterization going to them, and they're usually Superfund. I think they're all Superfund sites for that matter. And so I think those sites probably would not fall, for the most part, into...
They'd be more of a comprehensive analysis?
Yeah, more of a comprehensive approach, potentially. But
I think that would be the starting point. For sites that have complexities like multiple PRPs or multiple plumes affecting the same groundwater area, that those might be situations that don't lend themselves to the standardized approach.
Thank you.
Could I just ask a question about your injury year end? You've got temporary and permanent listed there. I'm just wondering.
So for the 5 that I'm going to show today, it's just permanent. Yeah.
Right, so when we did our first screen, we looked at all temporary and permanent solutions, and then ended up, so the first screen were all the sites that reached either a temporary or permanent solution milestone. Then those within that category that checked off groundwater 1, those within that category that affected groundwater, and then we decided out of all of those, we're gonna take out the temporary solutions, so then we ended up with the 36, of which this 5 were drawn. So it was basically part of our screening methodology, but it would not be a policy. The policy decision is to look at those that have reached a permanent solution.
So this may be less, if you had a temporary solution because it's economically infeasible to reach permanent solution, the damage would continue to accrue during that temporary solution period.
On the credit side, we also have the current year. We also want to know the year restoration starts. For this example, for this approach, we're talking about it starting today. We're starting in 2018. There's a number of different things that go into the restoration, and where the math really starts to come in is when we start to talk about the Zone 1 areas, and I'll also talk a bunch about the cost of land and how we came to that estimate. Yes.
Yeah, so how does we talked earlier about PPAs, and then you talked about those PPAs are designated based on their geology to some degree, that they're a medium or high yield area, ability to produce water for a drinkable source. And you talked about sometimes even in non-drinking water areas, not what you're talking about, but areas that aren't in a mapped aquifer, that in some states that they would still consider that a resource because of the future interest in developing them. But here in Massachusetts, it's been more that those areas to some degree have already kind of been identified, at least as sand-bearing aquifers, I think, to some degree, maybe off on that. But are you saying this will apply to non-GW1 areas?
No.
Okay, so we are, GW1 area is the starting point.
GW1 area,
Right.
yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No
problem.
Thank you for the clarification.
Karen, this is Heidi Ritchie. So I just have a question on that. So therefore, if we're only looking at groundwater that's used for water supply, I mean, what about the other ecosystem services value, like recharge to streams for aquatic life? That wouldn't apply?
Well, if, for example, I had mentioned that there were some releases that affected both groundwater and through sampling had indicated that those contaminants had also reached, say, a wetland or a nearby stream. Those we would look at we would look at those ecological impacts in addition to the groundwater. So we did not include them in this analysis, but many of the sites I mentioned, for example, Sutton Brook, there were contaminants to the stream and the groundwater, stream and the wetland in addition to the groundwater. So we would likely look at those in a more comprehensive approach. So if there has been demonstrated release of the groundwater to the stream by the site.
Didn't you mention when you did your screening, ones that had impacted wetlands, you screened those out?
Right, yep.
So,
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're starting to get into the math here. This is the simplest thing you're going to see, I think, going forward. So the injured volume is just multiplication. It's the area of groundwater times your acre. In NRD, people are often working in acres, so we convert things to square feet because we need a volume here. Times your recharge rate, and then converting it using 7.48 gallons per per cubic foot of groundwater. The recharge rate is the one thing we don't have. The area of groundwater contamination we were provided from the BWC forms The other two are conversions, and so we gotta get a recharge rate. Recharge rate varies depending on the precipitation, the geology of it. And so we take those from either USGS reports, or we take them from half the precipitation rate. And this is applied on a watershed basis, and I'll show you that in a second, but it's important to keep in mind that it's gonna vary from watershed to watershed, whether you're out on the Cape or you're in the western portion of the state. Things that dictate how fast it varies or how much it varies is the precipitation rates, how much rain is actually falling to recharge, evapotranspiration, how much is just evaporating off, runoff is occurring, as well as what's going on in the ground once it gets in the ground, or how easily it can get in the ground and infiltrate down into the aquifers itself.
Yeah, and I just want to point out on the cases that we've settled to date, because they were by and large either complicated 21E sites or NPL sites, they had site-specific recharge rates that had already been determined as part of the remedial action. So for this, we needed to come up with something that we could apply as a standard input, and we decided by watershed to see what we could find either in the literature or calculate.
Right. And that's a good point. For the comprehensive sites, they'll often do an investigation of recharge rates for those sites, and that's on every Superfund site or the bigger sites that I've worked on is the case. On the smaller sites, you don't have that. So there's a bunch of USGS reports for most of the state, and that's one of the columns there. The first column here. Otherwise, it's the second column, which is the average or half the precipitation rate, and the units are feet per year, and it ranged from 1.18 out in Shawsheen to the Cape and South Coastal, which is 2 1/4 inches. Sorry, 2 1/4 feet.
This is Andrea Donlan from the Connecticut River Conservancy. Can you go back to that other slide?
Sure.
I'm just noticing that the sources for some of the watersheds are pretty old, from the 60s, 70s,
Yeah.
80s.
That's correct. So,
And,
go ahead.
well, just precipitation rates have changed with climate change. So I think even the National Weather Service uses, averages that are not based on their whole period of record, but ones that are more, I don't know, the last 25 years or something like that. I'm not sure the exact number. Yeah, I would second that comment. This is Heidi again.
That's my understanding as well. There's different approaches to this, and depending on where you are in the country, you're going to see or you're going to, even potentially within the state, you're going to see recharge rates and precipitation rates that could be going up or going down historically. And so, in one sense, it's important to think about whether, if it's going up, that these could represent an underestimate, or if it's going down, it's a potential overestimate of the recharge rate.
Right, but I'm glad for all the comments that come up today, because they're definitely something for us to think about moving forward. So, I guess for now, just think about this in terms of the purposes of this analysis.
Right, and Karen, this is Heidi. If I can provide one other comment on that, you might want to look at the data that EEA is using in the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. They've worked with UMass to develop a lot of fine-scale data, including precipitation data that's much more current.
Thank you.
That's a good suggestion. Thanks.
Thank you. So this brings us to the discount rate, which is 3%, so it doesn't need its own slide. We're going to go to how we calculate the debit here. I'm sorry, was there a question on the phone? So PV is abbreviation for present value here, and it's the sum every year from the time of contamination to the time the remedial actions are done or the cleanup is done. And you start with your annual injured volume of groundwater, which is the second column here. And to get your present value, it's 1 plus 3%, and then you're raising it to your time period there each year. So it's the current year minus the year you're in. So we're in 2018 minus 1995. 2018 minus 1996, and so on, all the way down until you get to 2018. And then the way you, one check, the quality assurance check, is that when you're in 2018 down here, which you can't see on the table here because it was permanent solution was reached in 2014 in this example, you end up with the numbers being the same because it's in this year, so your present value doesn't change. So your stored quantity of groundwater is the required annual replacement volume. So from this here, we add it all up in the third column, and that's what the sum is there, obviously. So we get a total injured volume over time in present value terms. And your annual replacement then is what you need in perpetuity every year to get back that same volume.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah. Present value of an in perpetuity payment is your payment period divided, payment per period divided by your discount rate. And so this is from the economics literature or the finance literature. If you're looking at an annuity in perpetuity, instead of going through the annuity formula, you're dividing it by the discount rate. So I can solve for payment per period because that's just math, and I get my present value times my discount rate gets me what my payment per period is. So now my payment per period is how much I need to get back each year in perpetuity.
And how does restoration in perpetuity square with the concept of the department and the state accepting a permanent solution as a solution?
So the question is, how does restoration square with the department accepting a permanent solution?
Well, if you've accepted in the program that my injury was a 10-year injury, but yet my damages are being calculated as though my injury was a permanent.
No.
This
Your
is
restoration, your credit. You're being given credit for a perpetual benefit of restoration.
Yeah.
So you're actually being given a benefit on that side.
So this is restoration.
Yeah.
This is your compensation for the injured volume. This is not part of your permanent solution. It's occurring outside the area of impact generally.
Right,
And
so even though your injury might only be 10 years, when we determine how much restoration is required to compensate for that 10 years, we're giving it a credit beyond the 10 years.
Yeah.
So
You're not valuing it as though it
it's just
needed
ends
to
it
produce
in
a-
use.
Yeah.
Right.
So
I want to
if
think about that, not sidetrack.
No worries, I can
It's a good-
send some references
good-
around that'll help with that.
it's a good question, and it's not something that we haven't talked about before in too many situations to count. But in perpetuity
Is the
gives
gold
you-
standard.
Well, it depends on your point of view.
No, what I'm saying is, when we're in, like, for example, if we're in a negotiation and we have a particular, like a specific type of restoration project, and we know, for example, its design life is 30 years, we will only give credit for 30 years. But we often, in a negotiation, will be asked, can you, what about perpetual? Because it's what usually RPs want, is restoration credit in perpetuity.
Because if I reduced your if you had 10,000 gallons present value lost, your injured volume lost, you need to replace that. If I replace that over 10 years, you need to produce 1,000 gallons of recharge every year for 10 years. If I do it in perpetuity, it's 3 gallons per year. So you need much less land than if you get, is it 30? Sorry, Paul.
All I was going to comment.
3%, 10,000 divided by 3%.
This is one of those things that we do need to get right in explaining kind of how the process works.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And it's very easy for those of us who have been involved in this level of detail, which, you know, for the record, I would not include me, to understand it. But it's something that, you know, it makes sense from kind of the economic point of view and the environmental protection point of view, but it's not that easy to describe kind of how it works and why it makes sense and why people should look at it as kind of a good and appropriate way of doing it.
Right.
So I think if you have questions, then the broader community is going to have even more questions. And we need to find the right way of describing this so that it makes sense.
Yep.
I think we're definitely having difficulty understanding the in perpetuity piece of it, because also sort of like, well, what's the point? If they only have to fix, you know, like 3 gallons because we get that forever, then like why bother at all, right? Like there's got to be some real number.
So in this case, so 3 gallons is an example.
Yeah.
But
in perpetuity makes things go like is infinite.
Yes, that is true. But because we've got a discount, so back up for a second. First answer your why 3 gallons is that just there. I think the idea is that there would be lumping of the small projects together to make one big project. So you would put multiple 3 gallons together to make a project within a watershed. So that takes care of that. The in perpetuity piece is the gold standard, to use Karen's phrase, and the answer ends up being the least amount of compensatory restoration, or less compensatory restoration than if you had 10 years, or if you had 30, or if you had 50. That being said, when you start, if you do it and you plot it all out, when you start to get out to 100 years and 200 and 500 years, that 3% discount rate makes it negligible, right? Because it's so far out in the future that I could give you like a penny today, and in 1,000 years, that penny would be at $10 or I don't know, whatever it is. But at a 3% discount rate, you know, you're talking minimal damages when you get out beyond 100 years. So oftentimes, when we have to do comprehensive assessments, we'll carry it out 100 years, because beyond 100 years, there's not much of a difference. But to make it standard and to not have as many rows in the formula, you're having a present value in perpetuity is the payment period divided by, is the present value times the discount rate.
It also helps match up with the assumption, or, I don't know, it's assumption or input. I guess you can just tell me what to use, the right word to use. But because we are using aquifer protection, like actual acquisition of land, as the way to quantify, it matches well with that, because that type of restoration project would be expected to produce those kind of benefits. When we're in other situations where we have, as I mentioned, a very specific restoration project that has a known lifespan of less, we'll use that less amount.
Yeah, I think another way of looking at that, and that's the way I was thinking of it, is we're standardizing this whole process to how much land would you need to purchase and protect in order to settle the damages. And so by looking at in perpetuity, what area of land would we own forever? Or you could look at it as a shorter time period, but when you're talking about protecting land, it doesn't necessarily make sense to set a shorter time period. Yes, that could be the same as protecting 10 acres of land for 10 years. but then at the end of 10 years, you're no longer protecting those 10 acres. Or 1 acre of land in perpetuity, which would you rather have? If they're, and I didn't do the math, so they're probably not mathematically equal, but you could protect more for a shorter period of time, or protect a smaller amount forever in perpetuity. And
Right.
I think we're standardizing it to that, protect smaller areas of land, but forever, rather than giving it back, or removing the protections after 10 years. That's kind of the way I'm thinking.
And in some cases, there's very good reasons, like the lifetime of the project, or if you're doing a coastal wetlands restoration project, erosion, and like for Deepwater Horizon, Gulf of Mexico restoration projects, a lot of them are focusing on wetlands restoration. Their lifetime is only 20 or 30 years, even with all the controls that they're putting in because of the loss of wetlands in the Gulf.
Even the PowerPoint
Yeah, it didn't like
went
it.
to sleep.
Okay.
It didn't want to do any more math.
So now we gotta get our cost of restoration. We know what our payment is. We now gotta get our cost of restoration. And in Massachusetts, we have the Zone 1, Zone 2, the Inter-Head Wellhead Protection Areas. So we can calculate how much land is required for protection. It's based on the pumping rate, which is your annual amount divided by 365.25 days, because that's how long a year is. And so you've got your IWPA approach. But if you look at this formula, you start with 32 times the pumping rate in gallons per minute plus 400. So you could have 0 replacement required and still end up with 400 feet to protect, a radius of 400 feet to protect. So that didn't work. So we move on to Zone 1 radius versus the pumping rate. And this works better because you've got minus 350. So there you can have something to protect even when you have no annual replacement requirements for compensation. But you have this log component of it, which I think it was high school math when we were doing this kind of stuff. Because we have a log at a minus 350, at first it actually the slope is negative. And eventually it hits 0, and then it increases again. And that log, if you solve for it, it's 215.44 approximately. There's some rounding in there. And that's your pumping rate. And so for these purposes, I said that is the de minimis pumping rate, which also translates to about 3/4 of an acre. And we set the de minimis acreage at 1 acre. Less than 1 acre.
All right, so if your disposal site / area of impact was less than 1 acre, we just set it aside, and actually that set quite a number of RTNs aside in this analysis.
And at the same time, you could have a larger site that has a pumping rate, compensatory pumping rate of less than 215. So you could have a 10-acre site that's only contaminated for 1 year,
Right.
in a low recharge area, so you get a low volume replacement requirement divided by 365. Your pumping rate's less than 215 gallons per day. You end up in the de minimis category in this approach here.
And I just want to highlight that the reason we switched to the Zone 1 is because by and large, the sites that we are looking at in this analysis are small. We still use and will continue to use the interim wellhead protection area for sites that are large, and we did use that formula for all the cases up to this point because the area of contamination was large and the timeframes were large.
clarify, how would you determine when it was going to be a zone 1 versus an IWPA method? You said large. But
So
was there-
all of these are zone 1.
Okay.
The IWPA is for a comprehensive assessment that's not part of this approach.
And how would you know when to do those?
It could be that it's commingling, it could be a very large site, it would be up to discretion
Yeah, I
of
mean,
the DEP.
it could either be large acres or long time frames or both.
So from a.
But what I will do in response, I will indicate what those were for those other sites where we did apply the comprehensive approach. I just can't remember them off the top of my head, but that's a good question.
But for the purposes of the regulations and putting a standardized approach in regulations, what would we say, or what would we put in the regs to say, so that people are clear that I
Right.
have a site with these characteristics. It's huge, there are multiple PRPs, you know, how would I know that the process isn't eligible, I guess, is what I'm saying, for the standardized approach?
Well, we've talked about some of them today. I was making notes on that same issue because we're still actually looking at that and trying to define that. But we talked about outside of GW1 area, that's obvious. Possibly commingled plumes would just make it too complicated, not yet a permanent solution. Ecological injury, that was significant in addition to the injury to the groundwater, drinking water resource. So those are a few, but that's still up for discussion, I think. I'm trying to
But those
figure
kind
that
of
out.
criteria would be
Right.
specified in the regulation, so it would
Right.
be clear kind of when you're down this path versus something like being outside the GW1 area, that would be an indication perhaps of no NRDA for at least for drinking water purposes. And then some of the others would be the difference between going down a standardized approach versus a comprehensive approach.
And then the last one would be whatever de minimis is, how we define that.
Yes.
So there's no factor for how much over the standard is one question I had. And is there a factor for, when we're talking about area, and maybe if you do it this way, it gets at that because it's a pumping rate, but how about,
Depth of the plume. So for folks on the phone, the first question was, is there no consideration for how far over the standard you are? And the answer to that is no, there is no consideration because once you're over the standard, that groundwater is now off limits. It cannot be considered. So that's by the standards set forth. There's not a gradient. Well, if you're 10% over, you can use some of it, or you can drink 1 cup a day per month or something. So it's either all or none in the regulations. And the second question was the depth of the
yeah, I mean, if it was the area
Yeah.
would tend to put it into this, but
Yeah.
it's, it's only a foot
Right.
thick, or it's 100 feet thick, whatever.
So that's good. That's a good question. One we've dealt with before, and you would normally not be allowed to sink a well through contamination and draw from below it because you would be dragging the contamination down into the lower part of the aquifer if you're pulling from that area.
Depends on the aquifer.
Depends on the aquifer, correct, but normally you would not be allowed to. So once you're within an aquifer, you've contaminated that aquifer. The complication which I dare to mention here is that what if there's multiple aquifers with confining layers in between them? That's a different scenario that this is not taken
Intended to, right.
Yeah, this is not intended to, does not take into account if you have either multiple aquifers of contamination or somehow you manage to a deeper aquifer is contaminated but the upper aquifer is not contaminated, which I guess can be possible as groundwater migrates.
I think
We
in
have not
those
dealt with
cases, that would be again, complexity where we would look at more comprehensive analysis of.
But those are not questions I haven't heard So one thing to note is that there is a minimum zone 1 radius of 100 feet that comes out of the zone 1 manual. And that is not accounted for here. Theoretically, you could get to less than 100 feet here. So area of a circle, pi r squared. So geometry now. And the costs of restoration is the last piece here. There's a couple different options for going through cost of restoration. When you're looking at land purchase, there's other things. You can build recharge basins, retrofit recharge basins, etc. But just focusing on land costs here. There's actual transaction values, mass land records. You can look at what the actual costs were for undeveloped vacant land that you can set criteria for, less than an acre, more than 10 acre, whatever you want to set. There's assessed values that if they're meant to actually reflect the value of the land, then you can use assessed values. In some states, you'll see that we have not used assessed values because some states they don't actually reflect the value of the land. And in Massachusetts, there's the cherry sheet reimbursement program, which I only recently became familiar with, but that is the state-owned land valuations for tax reimbursements. Is that the right way of explaining it? Yeah. For tax reimbursements, and that is what we ended up using here. And for inquiring minds, cherry sheet is just because they used to be printed on cherry-colored paper a long time ago. But I couldn't let it go. I had to find out why.
You could have called me.
Yeah. I like to limit the number of questions I ask.
And just FYI, on the comprehensive method, we use the assessed values because we're looking at a particular municipality. Whereas for this, we're looking at watersheds again, or regions.
Right, and
which
so,
you'll see.
right, so for assessed values, we'd have to go to each town and get the assessed values, and when you're talking about one site, one site in a town or with 3 towns, that's one level of effort, but if you're talking about the whole state, that's another. We also, so we assign the cherry sheet values to a watershed based on the town they were in. Yes, there's some towns that span watershed boundaries, but we looked at it qualitatively, admittingly, and assigned it to a town at this point, and we can provide the spreadsheets for this. And we end up with the number of parcels per watershed, the total value of those parcels, so we added up all those parcels and divided it by the total acres. And so that gives you basically a weighted average. You could take the average value, there's any the median, the different ways of doing it. Weighted average is the most reflective of it, and that's what we've used historically. And it ranges, as I said, as low as just under 1,000 to 34,000. Sorry, up to 63,000 in Shawsheen. And there's a statewide was 6,267. So then we're multiplying.
Just a question on that.
Yes.
So for this purpose, you're using the cherry. This is to establish a surrogate for the value of land to be acquired for watershed protection.
Mm-hmm.
So you're using the cherry sheet method, but then under the wetlands program, you were doing the wetlands restoration acquisition, which is a totally different calculation.
Yep.
For fish and wildlife, fish and game.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the rationale for 2 different approaches to land valuation where the goal is acquisition of it for environmental protection?
Well, the citation for the oil spill method is for actually the cost of creating an acre of wetlands. It's it's based on actual restoration projects.
Right.
It's not really an acquisition cost. It actually doesn't include.
It's a surrogate for that because ultimately what's happening is wetlands are being acquired. There's not a lot of restoration going on.
So
Right, but the actual number itself is based on actual wetland creation projects. And that is ultimately the measure that we're
That's the
using for
resource that
that.
is being replaced. So
Right.
all of the oil spill impacts were quantified in wetland services. And if they were open water impacts, they were converted to wetland services, you remember? From
Yeah, no, I remember that,
Yeah,
but-
so the services that are being replaced in the oil spill are the wetlands wildlife habitat services, and that in the groundwater case, you're replacing the recharge protection. You're getting back the same volume of groundwater. So there's two different things, and you cannot in the NRDA regs take an injury to fish and replace it with an injury to groundwater. Sorry, replace it with a restoration to groundwater, or vice versa.
But you're using acreage of land value.
There are different types of land. So like
Right.
this is upland, whereas wetlands wouldn't be recharging.
No, I understood. I understand, and actually, I think you come out backwards, don't you? A lot of those land values are, in the French River watershed, you got $3,000 an acre. My guess is your wetlands restoration number is much higher.
It is.
And
It
so
is.
it's counterintuitive that to buy upland in the French River watershed, I'm paying $3,000 an acre. To restore wetlands in the same watershed, I'm paying more, even though if I went out and bought them, I would be paying less for wetlands.
I'm not.
No, I follow him, and
Okay.
actually, this was one of our biggest challenges in coming up with a standard approach, because as I mentioned, when we do the comprehensive method, we look at the community that the injury occurred in and the restoration would likely occur in. And so, for that, we actually look at the assessed values, and we look at, as Scott mentioned, a range of acreages that we feel is related to the acreage of injury and the type of restoration we're trying to achieve, and we look at developable and potentially developable parcels, and it is a much more representative number of what you would actually need to implement in that community. And we struggled with, how do we come up with something that we can apply on in a standard way with a less degree of effort than that other analysis involves? And is there anything that we can rely on that's already sort of published annually? So it would be great to get some feedback on, with the keeping the goal of a standard approach in mind, are there other ways that we could do it that might be more realistic? Because it's really a big struggle when it comes to coming up to valuing this. Exactly.
Well,
Yep, you've hit on
lead to
exactly
that
the
question.
struggle. Yes.
Right. I hear all that, this is Heidi again, but also, there's the issue of restoration, versus acquisition. Acquisition doesn't really actually create anything new, but it, protects that upland from development so to continue to serve the water recharge and protection function, whereas, wetlands provide a whole host of services which are very complicated and difficult to replace. It is a complicated issue, but I can see why, paying to restore wetlands that have been damaged could potentially be a more expensive per acre enterprise, even though just the dollar value of the land per acre may be less because it's not developable. But I had another question. Can I ask another question on this?
Sure.
In regards to the valuation? So are the lands, the state-owned lands that you were looking at, the assessed values, is there a difference in value, when the state, say, purchases land, if they're buying uplands, they have to pay the actual value of the land, which may be developable land at the time, but then once it's permanently conserved, is it assessed at a lower value because it is protected land? And how would that affect this analysis?
That's a good question, actually. I don't have an answer for it, but I'm gonna definitely note it as a question we need to follow up on.
And is this land is not all land that's set aside as preserved land, correct? This could be also any land the state owns that is not taxable.
True.
So it could be
Yeah.
courthouses, it could be state.
Right, but this is for undeveloped properties.
But you're right, the cherry
But it-
sheets
it's
include all those
state
kinds of
hospital
parcels, but we
land, for
took out.
example, it's undeveloped but unprotected.
I'm sorry, say that
This is
again.
Andrea Donlin from the Connecticut River Conservancy. I'm just looking at the Deerfield in particular. I mean, there's highlighted the high and the low. I don't know if you've done any analysis about how that wound up so incredibly low. I mean, out of weighted average, is that supposed to imply that it's $900? You could buy an acre of land for $990 out here?
That's what the cherry sheet value of the land is. And the analysis, that post hoc analysis, if that's what it sounds like that's what you're asking about, that was done was the high and the low and even the middle were highly sensitive to a single large or small property that was either very expensive per acre or very cheap per acre. So you could think of a very small, in this scheme, on the cherry sheet, a relatively small, I shouldn't say very, a relatively small parcel in the Boston watershed that is expensive per acre compared to 100 acres or 500 acres out west somewhere that ends up being per acre a lot less. And that's what it's sensitive. That's what it's sensitive to. And that's true, I think, with any of the methods we have used, whether we've used transaction values, assessed values, or for in this case, the state-owned land cherry sheet values. They are highly, highly sensitive to the outliers, and that's why we have looked at using the median and different measurements of central tendency, but in the end, the weighted average is ends up being the most applicable or the most realistic for actually, when talking to the conservation managers who are actually out there acquiring lands and managing them.
But it is an open question that we put to all of you, is whether you have other options for identifying in a nice, straightforward, standardized, kind of unarguable way.
Yeah.
You know, so that we're not in a position of in each and every one of them kind of there being a question of what value should I plug into.
Right.
And that's what we're looking for here, is something that is readily available, easy to find, and is updated periodically, that would reflect to a greater or lesser extent, hopefully greater, the actual land acquisition costs.
Right.
All options would be
yeah, this, I don't have any stake in the cherry sheets. So.
Yeah.
Except the name.
And that's a good example for kind of everything that we're talking about here, is this is one way of doing it.
Yep.
And just because we're presenting it is, you know, we've gone through it and, you know, this is what we kind of thought, well, this might work. This would be a good way of doing it. We are open to any other alternative ways of doing it for all of these different factors. Because we haven't thought of everything. You guys have a lot more experience. And when we bring this to a larger audience with the draft regs, we'd hope to get even, you know, bigger, better feedback as well.
So, given that, I want to ask, when you were talking about those dollars in the cherry sheets, you were saying that that's government-owned, undeveloped land.
Yes.
So, what about the fact, and I'm making an assumption here, that in many places in Massachusetts, I would assume that if you wanted to protect land, there's undeveloped land that's privately owned, and that would be the more appropriate land to acquire and protect.
Certainly.
And more valuable.
Right. There would not be.
Yeah.
We would not.
That's what I was getting at.
Right, and in our comprehensive method, that's exactly what we focus on, but that's the time and data intensive effort, because you have to every year get the data from the town and look at the developable or the potentially developable parcels of a certain size and what are they valued at, because you're exactly right, that is the approach we take for the comprehensive method.
I guess my concern is that, in my experience, state land is not, government-owned land is not valued at its like true value if it was gonna be developable, right? Like it's like in the assessor's database. In Medford's assessor's database, we don't even recognize a lot of the land because it's not worth the effort of the assessors because they're not taxing it. And therefore they pay no attention to those numbers. So then I get concerned that those numbers are being used for purposes that actually sort of try to reflect their value. And if in fact the goal is to protect the wellheads, the watersheds, you are much less concerned about already publicly owned land. A lot of that is inherently protected.
Right, so this is there is no, sorry if that was confusing, there is no intent to go out and purchase land that's already protected. It's just a proxy, it's an estimate of the cost or the value of that land, so how much it would cost to protect another parcel that's the same size somewhere else. So it's not actually going to those same government lands, but you are absolutely correct. There is the potential that it does not reflect the true cost of that land. It's also what the economists would call a arm's length transaction, right? So when you look at, you could sell your house to your sibling or your child, that's not an arm's length transaction. Whereas if you put it on the market and there's a bid for it, then that is an arm's length transaction. So normally we would look to, and the economists have ways of if we're looking at transaction values, like we go to Redfin or one of Zillow, and we download all the transactions for the last 5 years, and we do this in different states. The economists have ways of identifying likely non-arm's length transactions because they just don't fall within a certain range. In other words, they're outliers, but the economists call them non-arm's length transactions.
Right. I guess because I'm thinking that the end result here, the goal is to be able to provide a dollar that somebody gets charged, that somebody else then takes the money and does the right thing with it. And in many of these cases, protecting the land. And as one of those people who then has to take the money and do the right thing, it's really painful when we get stuck with the wrong amount of money. And you can't do what you wanted to do. You can't do what you said you were going to do, or you should do, and then you're like, do I do something that's not really worthwhile because otherwise then I give the money up, or like how do you come out of that? It's a bad place to be, which is why where I don't actually ever see myself being involved in one of these because of land in Medford. At the same time, I don't want my peer in Northampton to get stuck with the wrong amount of money to do what you want him to do.
And one way that
I'm just going to interject an idea. This is Andrea Donlin again, and I have to sign off, but I'm wondering whether it has to be, I'm not sure about the cherry sheet idea, and this is outside of my area of expertise, but would it be possible to group watersheds to kind of iron out some of these inconsistency problems? Just have all of the watersheds in Eastern Mass grouped together, because it seems like the Shawshene is abnormally high, the Deerfield is abnormally low, and it may not be representative or may not be achieving your goals. So that's just an idea, but I'm not going to be able to continue on. Sorry.
Thank you, Andrea.